Hey everybody, so in this very quick lecture, we're going to look at European cultural movements, but to kick things off, I want you to do a quick, what I call a time traveler's test. I want you to go back in time to 1730s. I want you to pick a northern colony or southern British colony and put yourself in that situation. Put yourself there. Think about what role you play, what gender you might be, what's your role in the society there. And now bring the camera out, bring the lens out, think of yourself there, and picture yourself in this larger world we've been exploring of the Atlantic world. Now, how does your own personal mind, your soul, and your wallet, how is that affected by your interaction in this new, larger Atlantic world? So, to put this in a different way, you've seen this map, you've looked at the triangle trade, and in this map you can easily see how your wallet would be affected. So picture yourself in a colony here, and how is your own personal wallet, or the wallet of those if they have means more around you and living in this colony, how does this map show how your wallet is bulging with money, or you might be poor, or what part of this system you're in. If you're a slave, you don't have a very big wallet, but you are the foundation of everybody's financial means. The slave system being the very bedrock of the economic system of this world. On this map too, you can really see the goods being exchanged, of things being created here, different monocrops being sent to Europe, but a system that's in these colonies are increasingly being dependent on European manufactured goods. And not just the colonies, but the native peoples that are connected increasingly are being dependent. And we're going to talk about this as we talk about the cultural movements. Now, not on this map. We can't really see how your own personal mind and your own spirit, your own soul is affected in this, but that's what we're going to look at. And we're going to look at it of one of many ways. And it's important to understand that there's an exchange of all these regions that's affecting your soul, that's affecting your mind, that's affecting your wallet. But we're going to look at it from the sense of Europe and its values, its cultural movements affecting your soul and your mind in the colonies. You with me? So we're going to look at that in two ways. And we've been looking at that this last couple of weeks in the Atlantic world. And this week we've been looking at the Enlightenment. We've been looking at now the Great Awakening and pietism. So we're going to look at piety, George Whitefield, Great Awakening, and the other side of the Great Awakening with a native awakening as nativists, not to be mistaken with later nativism. That's completely different. That's something you'll see more of in the second part of U.S. history. But in this, we're looking at nativists as part of a Native American movement connected to a revival of a different type of Great Awakening. This is all going to show us, very importantly, how the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening created social change in the British colonies. All right, you with me? So we're going to do this briefly. We're going to keep it pretty short. There's lots of readings in this section, but this is just to kind of help bridge some of the gaps and to fill in some blanks that you might have and some questions. So to get started, this is a bit of a review that you've looked at. We're looking at this week, we're looking at the Enlightenment and piety, these two cultural movements between 1690s and really up until Revolutionary War and beyond. But in the sense of this class, we're going to look at it, how it affects into what will become the Revolutionary War. So one side of it's the Enlightenment. At the very foundation of that is this idea of reason, power of human reason that shapes the world, appealing especially to well-educated men and women. Why is that? Well, we're talking about educated men and women, the merchants, the planters, these people that had time to go to school and get educated. And in fact, this increasingly over time is growing in society. More and more people are becoming educated, becoming literate. And that's important. They're able to read. They're able to read newspapers where they're able to read pamphlets of ideas. And that's going to play a huge role and expand the idea of reason. Now, in our class, we have the coffee shop, right? And the idea of the coffee shop, even in this time period, was a social place where everybody can come together and exchange their ideas and use their reason, use their senses, use experimentation to come up with answers. And that is the foundation of what the Enlightenment is. Sapere dare, dare to know, and they dare you to know everything through human reason. On the other side of that is piety and pietism, which is the emotional side. And this was a growth of an evangelical religious movement, stressing mainly we're looking at Christian values here, personal relationship with God, attracting many people, especially farmers, urban laborers. This is, we're actually going to see, think of a big rock concert where you really just get into the music. You're overcome by the music. You're dancing around and you might be crying or you might be mosh pitting. The emotion takes over. And that's what's happening with these evangelical religious movements. Don't know if they're mosh pitting, but there's an emotional response that's huge. Now, it's easy to think of these as two completely separate things, but that would be wrong. These are blurred together. These are people who are part of the Enlightenment, part of this evangelical movement, and in both ways, it promotes independent thinking. It creates a new colonial life transformed with intellectual and cultural reinvigoration of values that's being morphed into something new. Okay, so this is what we're going to be looking at here. This picture is kind of a nice way to see what we're talking about. You can see the crowd and how diverse and what's happening in this crowd and what's happening with this person. So I want you to think about what this picture might mean to you. Maybe comment on it. Let me know what you think. Have a look at that. But there's similar. This is now connecting to this revivalism, looking at this charismatic leader, this charismatic speaker that's being divinely inspired and to reach crowds. There, on the same token, there's other pictures, and you can Google it, of how this light, rather than being God or the Holy Spirit, is reason. So this picture works. I like this picture because you can use for both of what people are talking about when you're looking at the Enlightenment or piety, but it's attracted to everybody. And it's not just white rich males. It's not just the founding fathers we're talking about here. We're talking about everyone in colonial society. So pietism, and come on, this is the best picture of George Whitefield. Look at that guy. So pietism is an emphasizing devout behavior, emotional church services, really appealing to the heart. Now, George Whitefield is the main person always talked about with this. He was the very first celebrity in the colonies. Everybody knew who he was. If they had T-shirts of his traveling around, they would have been wearing it. People knew him in Europe. He would travel back and forth, and everybody knew who he was, and he was flamboyant. It's been talked about, and I put it in quotes, that he's highly sexualized style, transformed revivals, and what they're talking about at the root of it is he was using theatrics. He would break down and crying in the middle of his sermon, and he would jump around and he would move, and he, rather than just being a static talking head, kind of like in this video right now, where I'm just talking at you, he would be jumping around and really appealing to your emotion and crying. And he was close friends with Ben Franklin. I call him Ben. Most people write him as Benjamin Franklin, but we go way back. But Ben Franklin and George Whitefield were writing a lot back and forth together. There's lots of articles talking about their close friendship. But he talks about how he was moved with his emotional messages and moved so much that he would take his wallet out to put money into the offering. So he was kind of jesting, but at the same time, he was really moved by what George Whitefield said. And so he was really appealing to people. And the other side of that is another guy named Jonathan Edwards, also another guy, part of this New Light, and we're going to talk about what the New Light, Old Light is in a second. But I love this quote because it ties in something worth discussing here. So really quickly, I'll read it to you, that God is the highest good of the reasonable creature. The enjoyment of him is our proper and is the only happiness with our soul that can be satisfied. To go to heaven fully, to enjoy God, is indefinitely better than the most pleasant accommodations here on earth. Better than fathers and mothers and husbands and wives and children or the company of others or any earthly friends. These are but shadows, but the enjoyment of God is the substance. These are the scattered beams, but God is the sun. These are the streams, but these are but streams, God is the fountain. These are but drops, and God is the ocean. So a very charismatic, beautiful, poetic thing here. what I love about this is he's talking the very first thing. God is the highest good of the reasonable creature. What is that talking about? He is talking about and linking these two things together, isn't he? So if you're thinking about people tied to the Enlightenment, and you're going to read about deism. Deism being the idea that God is the eternal clockmaker. God made us, he gave us the ability of reason, then took the step back and let us go at our own devices. What keeps us going, what allows us to flourish, is the ability of reason that he gave us. That is what deism is. So Enlightenment thinkers, staunch, strong Enlightenment, are tied largely to this idea of deism, and therefore the reasonable creature, the most reason you have, is the most important thing. And think about people that you respect. Think about people you read or watch on TV or whatever, and think about how you really admire their reason, how you admire what they're saying. And what he's saying, what he's bringing back, Jonathan Edwards, is the most reasonable creature. No matter who you're talking about, God is the highest one. So he's bridging the gap of both the Enlightenment and piety, and bringing people back into the Christian mindset here. And I think that's an important thing what both men, George Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, are doing. Now, on the other side, let's have a look at what the Great Awakening does. It's very different how it affects North America, the northern colonies rather, and the southern colonies. These are two different places. We've already seen how they're vastly different in their foundation, but when we're talking about the mind and the soul, and we're talking about religion in these places, it's very different, and therefore the Great Awakening really affects them so much differently in both places. So on one side of it, northern colonies, these are, from the very beginning, they undermine the support of traditional churches. They undermined in England the Anglican Church, which, if you think of Catholicism, in a lot of ways, high Anglican is very much like that. There's certain ways of doing things that goes back to the Middle Ages. So it's a very performance. Yeah, what they're trying to stress more is a personal relationship, not the performance of the religion. So the old light on one side is that old traditional ways. So very from the beginning, they're trying to undermine that. That's what Puritans are doing, and others that are fleeing for their freedom, is they're undermining the old light. On the other end of the spectrum, and I'll switch that over here, is the southern colonies, which is founded by the Church of England, by the Anglican Church. So they are, the very foundation there is very connected to England and to the religious way of life. So that's going to affect the Great Awakening very differently. So back to the northern colonies, they're challenging authority from the beginning. And this new light is this, which the Great Awakening is seen as here, is the idea that any true Christian society, mutual love is the band and cement, not the value of the marketplace. So the wallet that we talked about in the beginning, not the most important thing. Everything that holds things together is the Christian values. The communal ethic of competition and that pursuit of wealth that we're talking about with this growing Atlantic economy is undermined and pushed down with the religious awakening that's happening. Are you picking up what I'm throwing down? I think you got it. Now, that's what's happening largely in this northern colonies. You might see that this very foundation starts to build schools and educate people, to build ministers to be able to expand this mission. So they bring schools, they teach Latin. We're looking at Samson Oldham, a Native American. We're going to talk about him at the end here, how he's part of this system as well, which becomes Dartmouth University. I think that's wrong. Let me know. Put me in a comment if you think about it. I'll remember in a second. Maybe, I don't think it was Princeton, but I think it was Dartmouth. These universities here, in the same way, founded in this time of the Great Awakening to educate people to be part of this movement of religious fervor and to spread that gospel and that evangelical movement. So Princeton, Columbia, Brown, Rutgers, Dartmouth, and some other ones as well. So that's happening in the north. On the other end of the spectrum, we got the south. And we got, again, this is challenging. The whole Great Awakening is challenging. So there's a lot of areas, and you're going to read about it in chapter 5. There's areas that would not allow outside. They would specifically say foreigners coming in who are preaching messages, they would kick them out. It would be illegal. So even Whitefield, who's as famous as he was, there was areas where he couldn't preach because they saw it as a threat to the undermining the religious authority of southern colonies. Think about Virginia and how connected it is to England at this time and the Anglican Church. All this undermines that authority. So it's a huge problem. Also in the South, though, and here's the other side, and this is the third part that I really want you to understand, is we're talking about southern colonies, the planters and the growers, and largely the white population. But what about the enslaved black population? It came as well. And this is an important thing. And this picture is part of this. This is a famous picture that's talking about this, of where there becomes very strong evangelical movement within the African American communities. And same way, appealing to emotion, lots of energy, lots of music, similar to church services now, we're just appealing to that emotion. And also, and I mentioned this before, that is very much tied to stories in the Bible of freeing enslaved people. And think of Abraham freeing the people from Egypt. Think about any story of taking the chains, and how when Jesus talks about the shackles being removed, this is a huge thing. And it becomes, rather than, you can't as a enslaved person be in the fields and say, we're going to be free one day. That's going to be a problem. But if you're talking about, if you're singing religious songs, if you're singing Christian songs about Abraham and freeing of his people, and you know in your mind and everybody around you is that you're talking about us and our people and our children, that is a very powerful thing. And it's a very powerful resistance that happens all the way up till the end of the Civil War and beyond. So even in the civil rights movements of the 60s, using these songs as means of breaking chains. The words of Martin Luther King Jr. very much connected to ideas and ideologies that's developed in this first Great Awakening. So that's a big part of it as well. Now, what about so the Slave Great Awakening, we talked about George Whitefield. He considered, and he spoke to African slaves. He spoke to, and this time too, there's a lot of freed African Americans, and he's considered African Americans spiritual equals. This becomes a foundational idea for abolition movements. Think of Equiano, and we'll talk about this in later weeks to come. But also Southern Carolina, Jonathan Bryan, he was a planter, but at the same time was building schools for black students. So you see a growth of education, even for slaves, to be able to be educated, to read the Bible for themselves and learn, and then even buy their freedom in a lot of ways, so therefore able to be educated members of the society. This changes a lot later on, but this is a foundation of that spiritual awakening that's happening in African American communities. Phyllis Wheatley, the first published poet, who was one of the students in the school, and wrote beautiful, you can check it out, Google it, wonderful poetry about colonial life and her and struggles as an African American female, but educated in this spiritual awakening. So it's another aspect that's an important part of this awakening story. Now, lastly, let's talk about the Native American side. How does the education and the European cultural movements affect Native Americans? Well, there's a Christian Native American awakening, and you're going to read it in this week with Samson Olcom. And he is the very epitome of a man who was converted to Christianity, who was educated in one of these schools, going to be Dartmouth, I believe, and he learns Latin, learns Greek, travels to England and meets the king, meets all the royalty, meets all the elites, and then he comes back, but he sees the hypocrisy. So on his side of it, he sees a hypocrisy. He sees the deep running racism that's still happening despite all of this Great Awakening that's happening. And his family that was promised to be taken care of was not taken care of and was malnourished and famine. And so he switches his guys. He's still a strong Christian, and he writes about that. A lot of his work is published. It's worth checking out. But he changes his guys away from converting, going back to England and being a missionary in England, in Europe, and talking to other white colonists in this way. He's still part of it, but he's really turning to help and better Native communities. This is a way that a lot of people have written about resistance and resistance of the colonial changes that are happening. And he's doing it within the Great Awakening and with Christian values to make a change. So Samson Oldham, you're going to read about, and you're going to see, I want you, when you read him, think about the mindset of this Great Awakening and how he's using those ideals and those values to talk about his method. There's a great book called The Indian Great Awakening by Linford Fisher that really talks about how the Christian Native Awakening is a resistance, a response to this growing material dependence and moving and away from the native values and way of life. And so in a way, by understanding and taking the Christian values and the power within the spiritual church and how powerful religion is, by using that and with working within it as a way of resistance. So in a lot of the same ways, like the African American communities, the slave communities who are also using it as a resistance, so are Native Americans. And so this book is really good. So the last section I want us to look at is the response, is a third response within the Christian Native Awakening of using this Great Awakening as a revival within the Indian community. If you think of the Great Awakening, of the main message there, to turn to God, to renounce sin and turn to God, and using charismatic revivalism to do that. Nativist and Neolin, for example, this spiritual leader of the Lenape or the Delaware tribe, what he says is, yes, turn away, not so much of sin, but turn away from the European ways, turn away from European material culture, turn away from everything that was come in here that's corrupted our land. And using values of Christianity, saying, look, God has now punished us because we've turned away from our values. So he's using this just in a lot of ways like Samson Oldham, but probably even stronger in this way of saying what's happening to our land. The death through disease, the death through famine is happening because God is punishing us because we're turning to the sin, and the sin being European ways. You picking that up? So, for example, he says, God has driven away wild game out of the country to punish Indians for killing the game and to trade for alcohol. So very European thing, alcohol. There was no alcohol, but with Indians, there's no resistance and antibodies for that. So there's a lot of science around how alcohol really affects Native Americans because haven't built the resistance and tolerance. A lot of like diabetes and things, if you're looking at that. So he's saying, look, a lot of people are turning to alcoholism, the European sin, and killing the game to trade it. And therefore, God has driven out the wild animals. He's saving the animals from the sin and corruption of the natives. So he's saying, resist that, resist the European culture, and they will come back. God first made three men. That's my favorite. God first made three men, the Indian, the Negro, and the white man. God made white men last so that they better not think of themselves better. And underlining that, who did God make first? He made the Indian. So who's the best in this trifecta? That would be right, the Indian. Now, this is interesting because the foundation of Enlightenment thought as well is hierarchies. Everything's categorized in science and life. And here, Neolin is doing the same thing. And he's categorizing how God made people. And he made Indians first. He made African Americans. In his mind, he made blacks. And he made whites. And so he talks about that in this as well. Ritual diet that includes tea induce vomiting to cleanse them of white people's ways and nature. So cleanse your body, cleanse your soul, cleanse your mind from European ways and return to native values. So in all these ways, and you can see how European cultural movements not only affected the rich white men. It affected men and women, and it affected African Americans as much as white settlers and colonists. But it also affected the Native Americans. And so when you're talking about and you're looking at your mind, your soul, your wallet, living in colonial times, it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you're a freed or an enslaved African American, whether you're Native American who's part of the colony now or in nearby tribes, or if you're talking about a rich or a poor white settler that's living in the colony. Every mind, soul, and wallet is affected by the Atlantic world, affected by European cultural movements of both the Enlightenment and this Great Awakening, but used in specific ways to help whatever their cause and empowerment way that they see fit, that they can use to create social change in the British colonies.